Hey everyone, so I'm going to be referring to um, the Grint book in this forum post um, quite a bit. I'm just going to be pulling out a couple things that I thought were pretty interesting. So, the chapter 4, talking about the different kinds of leaders, whether they're born, nature versus nurture, individualistic versus collectivistic. I think naturally when I first went into the chapter, I thought that I would be more aligned with the individualistic natural. I think that's an ideology that I've always just had. However, reading this, I really walked away with a better understanding of. I wasn't really meaning when I said nature, like a biological or genetic, but more so personality. And is personality something that I necessarily tie to genes or biology? Probably not. That's probably something that is more of a nurtured quality or characteristic. So, and then the idea of collectivism, I think just was brought out pretty strong here. I really like the example that he gave, or the sort of analogy that he gave of parenting in childhood, and that the children are actually the teachers of the parents. This on page 64, he says we might reconstruct this phrasing to say the follower is teacher to the leader. In speaking of this child and parent understanding. And I think when we had a conversation at residency, we were talking very much about, what really makes a leader. Is it those that follow him or her? Is it the qualities that are inherent to him or her? And with this analogy, it kind of really brings out this idea of those that follow him or her are sort of indicative of, um, or not indicative, but kind of like give way to that ability to teach. And it reminded me of bell hooks and sort of the transgressing process, and that being one of constant learning, collaborative learning, one of this sort of non-expert role necessarily, but privileging every voice and every experience, but also lifting up those experiences of those obviously that are oppressed or marginalized. But it brought into my mind that those things that we've been talking about with bell hooks. Then, if we go to chapter 5, this whole discussion of, the white man, alpha male, rich, privileged, really tied into this whole, white patriarchal, imperialistic, capitalistic society, heteronormative, you know, uh, society that we are a part of in this United States culture, and sort of that discussion that Bell Hooks really makes a point to. I actually watched one of her. It was like a talk she was giving at the New School a couple of years ago, and she really talks about why she no longer uses the word racism, but really makes a point to call it white supremacy. And that is because we kind of get conditioned to this idea or we're desensitized to the word racism and what that, it's kind of colorful almost in a way. White supremacy really draws out um, the level of oppression, and in the word supremacy you get this superior inferior stratification of people. And so uh, the sort of prototype of a leader being those that are white, that are men, those that are rich, those that are privileged. And we see so many examples of, even with the debates this week, how do you get a Kamala Harris, how do you get a Barack Obama, how do you get a Martin Luther King, that kind of like they're the antithesis to this, white male, handsome, alpha male, all that kind of stuff. Um, and yet those two, Barack and MLK, are both men. When you see Kamala, that's taking even on another nature, which is non-dominant gender. Um, so I thought that really tied in well to some of the discussions we were having about Bell Hicks and what really makes a leader. And I feel like truly that um, leaders are about are function within a collective, and it's about constantly about learning and evolving and shifting. And I see that sort of, I feel like we've seen it's this sort of isomorphic process with therapy, sort of isomorphic process with supervision, sort of isomorphic process with pedagogy, and like now this idea of leadership, like this sort of entrenched understanding, at least for me, I think I'm coming to understand and sort of adopting this sort of ever learning nature and this sort of, so this collective ideas and processing and collaborative way. And yeah, it's pretty cool to see how those ideas are coming up here, even in leadership. And then how do you privilege other voices in leadership, knowing that you have a certain skill set, but you recognize that the greatest amount of leading takes place when I'm listening, right? Through language, through communication. So I really like that. And then on page 85, this idea that leadership is a relationship. I think that really stood out to me as well. I think that we don't often conceptualize leadership in that way. We really see it, I think, predominantly in this sort of one-way experience, top-down experience. And I wonder if that's just a construct of, capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, rather than you and I are here. And in order for me to do well and for me to succeed, I need you. And in order for you to do well, you need me. And this sort of intertwined exchange, sort of symbiotic relationship in a way. It was an interesting concept for me because I honestly was part of those people that didn't necessarily think of leadership. I would think of it as relational, but not that it was like bi-directional in the way that it relates, but that it would be unidirectional, right? And I think it's how easy is it for us to sort of co-opt these dominant ideas that honestly don't even work for us, but because they're the larger narrative, they're the broader systemic idea, that we reject the relational piece or the multi-directional piece, and we really sink into the unidirectional. So that was pretty interesting. All in all, I think this book has been really informative. I think the way that he writes is really really easy to read, and he has really good stories and really good historical references, I think, that are meaningful and kind of put things in context, that even that that first chapter 4, where he's talking about the characteristics of Hitler and Stalin, and you show them in their school pictures, and sort of what about them would have turned them into the kind of leaders that they became, the kind of influence that they ended up having, when that wasn't necessarily readily seen as children, right? And so it really, I don't even think there's a clear answer, like how are leaders bred, it seems like, to me, I would say it's a nurtured, collectivist, collaborative process. But I also do believe that there is a certain level of skill set, whether it's charisma or sociability, as it mentions, or intelligence, as it mentions, but not too wide of a gap between the learners and the teachers. And so really trying to understand and sort of conceptualize what a true leader looks like has been interesting in this book, and I've appreciated the reading. Love to hear what you guys think.